Hi, my name's Rowena. My own brother slapped me like he saw blood right in front of the Pentagon's highest-ranking officers. He sneered, "This place isn't meant for failures like you." And as I stood there, humiliated and burning inside, I realized this wasn't the first time my family had erased me in plain sight. But that night, when the Admiral stepped forward, everything shifted. Before we dive in, tell me, where are you listening from right now, and what time is it there? Drop a comment below. I'd love to know. Because you're about to hear how a single moment of cruelty exposed a lifetime of betrayal, and why silence was never weakness, but the loudest answer I could give. I had told myself I wouldn't be nervous. It was just a ceremony, my husband's promotion, the culmination of years of work and sacrifice. The Pentagon ceremonial hall shimmered with polished brass and crisp uniforms, every chair filled with families and officials dressed to impress. The kind of room where a smile had to be measured, a handshake firm, and a whisper could echo louder than a shout. I adjusted the sleeve of my navy blue dress, feeling the cool silk glide against my arm. It had taken me longer than I'd like to admit to pick out that dress. I wanted to look dignified, nothing too flashy, nothing that might invite the sort of comments my family specialized in. My goal was simple: stand beside my husband, share his pride, and for once, not feel like the background character in my own life. Hadrian was already there, of course. My older brother thrived in rooms like this. Late 30s, confident stride, always acting as if every eye belonged on him. He didn't wear a uniform, he wasn't in the service, but he walked as though the whole hall was his stage. He caught my eye from across the aisle and smirked. That smirk. The one I'd grown up with. The one that said he knew exactly how to ruin my day. I straightened my back and forced myself to look away, focusing on the Admiral sitting near the front. A man of quiet authority, his presence alone could hush a restless crowd. He hadn't spoken a word yet, but I felt his gaze sweep the room like a searchlight. The ceremony began smoothly. Names called, ranks announced, applause breaking in neat, respectful waves. My husband stepped forward, his shoulders squared, and I felt a swell of pride that nearly pushed tears to my eyes. For a brief moment, I believed the night could stay perfect. Then Hadrian moved. It happened so fast I barely had time to process. One second I was smiling, clapping for the man I loved. The next, Hadrian was at my side, his face twisted with something between anger and contempt. His hand came down across my cheek, sharp and unrelenting. The sound cracked louder than I could have imagined in that sacred, hushed hall. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman's hand flew to her mouth. A man dropped his program. The sting on my skin bloomed, hot and humiliating, spreading faster than my mind could catch up. Hadrian leaned in close, his breath steady but laced with venom. "This place isn't meant for failures like you." His words sliced deeper than the slap. My stomach dropped as I felt hundreds of eyes turn toward me, some filled with shock, others with a strange curiosity, as though they'd just witnessed a car crash and couldn't look away. I wanted to say something, anything, but my throat locked, not out of weakness, but because silence was the only weapon I had left in that second. I'd learned long ago that my brother fed off reactions. If I broke down now, he'd win. My husband turned, confusion flashing across his face. He started to step toward me, but the Admiral's gaze caught him, a silent command to hold. The Admiral's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, steady, unflinching, that anchored me. The room felt suspended in a single breath. No one clapped, no one moved. Hadrian straightened his jacket as if nothing had happened, scanning the crowd with that same smug arrogance. He believed he'd just written the headline of the night. But as my cheek burned, I raised my eyes and locked them on the Admiral across the hall. He didn't flinch, didn't turn away. He looked right at me, unblinking, as though he already knew what was coming next. And then, My brother leaned in again, ready to twist the knife even deeper. I could feel the weight of the room pressing against me, every breath, every glance, every whisper magnified in that cavernous hall. My cheek still stung from his hand, but it was the smirk curling on his lips that burned hotter. He didn't need to raise his voice. He wanted the humiliation to drip like poison, slow and deliberate. "They only let you in here because of who you married," he murmured, just loud enough for the rows around us to hear. "Not because you belong." A ripple ran through the audience. Not the kind of gasp that comes with shock. No, this was different. It was softer, a rustle of whispers, the kind that says people are repeating the words to themselves, deciding whether they agree. I saw a woman near the aisle glance at her husband, eyebrows raised as if to say, "Is he wrong?" Another officer's wife leaned in toward her friend, their heads touching as they shared a hushed remark. My stomach clenched. I wanted to defend myself. I wanted to stand tall and make it clear I had every right to be here, but I stayed rooted to the spot. My lips pressed together, my shoulders drawn back, pretending composure when inside I was unraveling. I told myself silence was dignity, but in that moment it felt like surrender. Hadrian knew it too. His smile widened, subtle, the kind of grin that looked innocent from a distance but reeked of triumph up close. He thrived on my restraint, mistaking it for weakness. The Admiral hadn't moved. He sat a few rows ahead, still watching me with that steady, measured gaze. His expression didn't change, but there was something in the way he observed, like he was cataloging every detail, every word, waiting for the precise moment to act. I shifted my weight slightly, trying to steady myself, but it only made me more aware of the dozens of eyes on me. The whispers didn't stop. They multiplied, circling me like smoke. Words I couldn't quite catch but felt all the same. Failure. Doesn't belong. Only through him. I swallowed hard. My hands trembled, hidden in the folds of my dress, and I forced myself to take a slow breath. My father's voice echoed faintly in my memory, his favorite lecture whenever I dared to dream too loudly. "You're lucky if people tolerate you, Rowena. Don't expect more." And here was Hadrian, proving him right in front of the highest-ranking officers in the country. One of the women sitting nearby whispered a little too loudly, "She should just leave quietly." The words stung, not because they were new, but because they sounded so familiar. The kind of casual dismissal I'd lived with my whole life. I felt the sting in my eyes, a warning that tears wanted to break free. But I clenched my jaw and refused to let them. If I cried, I'd give him everything he wanted. If I broke, he'd win. Hadrian leaned even closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear, though I knew the body language alone was a performance for the room. "You'll never fit here, Rowena. You were always the weak link." I inhaled sharply, but said nothing. My silence made his smirk deepen, as if he'd already claimed victory. Behind him, I caught a glimpse of my husband still frozen near the podium. He looked torn between rushing to my side and respecting the unspoken rules of the ceremony. The Admiral gave him the smallest shake of his head, barely noticeable, but enough to keep him still. It wasn't abandonment, it was calculation. I could feel it. The hall was suffocating. I kept my chin high, my eyes forward, pretending I didn't feel the whispers pressing against my back, like hands shoving me toward the door. Inside, though, I was raging. Not just at Hadrian, but at every single person who sat and watched, who whispered and judged, who let this happen without a word. I forced myself not to cry, not to give him the satisfaction of visible pain. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, my cheek burned, and my dignity felt like it was slipping through my fingers. And when Hadrian smirked again, so sure of his victory, I realized he thought he had already won. But he didn't know that this wasn't the first time I'd been erased in plain sight. The sting on my cheek faded into a dull throb, and the sound of whispers in the Pentagon hall began to blur, as if the walls themselves were breathing against me. My brother's words weren't new. They were echoes of a lifetime I'd tried to bury. The past has a way of crawling back when you least want it, and that night it came crashing down like a tide I couldn't stop. Suddenly, I wasn't standing in the ceremonial hall anymore. I was back at my parents' dining room table years ago, the same suffocating air of judgment pressing against my chest. It had been a holiday dinner. The table was set with my mother's heavy china, candles flickering, a roast turkey sitting in the middle as if everything in our family were picture perfect. I remember smoothing down my dress, nervous even though I had nothing to hide. I'd been working double shifts at a diner to save up for my last year of college, all while keeping my head low and trying not to cause ripples. Hadrian, smug even in his 20s, leaned back in his chair, telling a story about how he had made sacrifices so I could finish school. "Yeah," he'd said with that lazy grin, "it wasn't easy covering her tuition, but someone had to step up." I froze, my fork mid-air. The words hit me harder than the slap tonight. He hadn't given me a dime. I had worked until my feet blistered, sometimes falling asleep on textbooks at 3 a.m. just to make it. But he spun the story so easily, so confidently, that my parents never questioned it. "Oh, Hadrian," my mother cooed, reaching across to pat his hand. "You've always been such a responsible son. We're so proud of you." And my father, God, the way he beamed. "That's why you'll go far, son. Taking care of family the way a real man should." I looked down at my plate, heat crawling up my neck. My throat felt tight, words locked inside. I wanted to shout, "It was me! I earned that money! I gave up sleep and health to pay every cent," but I didn't. I sat there, invisible, swallowing roast turkey that tasted like ash. Across the table, Aunt Celeste caught my eyes. She didn't smile. She didn't nod along like the others. Instead, she leaned closer when no one was watching and whispered, so only I could hear, "One day they'll choke on what they've done to you." Her words planted themselves deep inside me like a seed I didn't know I needed. I held on to them that night, even as the applause for Hadrian's supposed generosity grew around the table. My parents raised their glasses to him. My cousins laughed at his jokes. And I sat there in silence, erased even in the middle of my own sacrifice. Back in the hall, I blinked, the memory dissolving into the cold glow of chandeliers overhead. The sting on my cheek reminded me I wasn't that girl anymore, but the shame felt just as raw. Hadrian's smirk hovered inches from me now, just as it had across that dinner table years ago. Nothing had changed. He was still stealing credit, still puffing himself up on my silence, and the crowd, whether family or strangers, was still willing to believe him. But I remembered Aunt Celeste's whisper. I remembered how her voice cut through the noise that night, giving me something to hold on to when I felt like nothing. That fragile thread of hope tugged at me even now, urging me not to let this moment define me. I drew in a breath, holding my head just a little higher. I didn't speak yet. I wasn't ready to. But I let the silence stretch, not as surrender, but as something sharper, something that would one day slice through his lies. As the applause swelled for Hadrian that night, I sat invisible in the corner. Yet Aunt Celeste's words have never left me. And now, standing in that hall years later, I finally felt the truth of her warning. The sting on my cheek had dulled, but the heat of humiliation still burned beneath my skin. The ceremonial hall, once filled with a kind of solemn pride, now felt suffocating. Conversations had lowered into hushed tones, broken only by the clinking of metals brushing against uniforms as officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I could feel their eyes sliding toward me, quick and sharp, before darting away, as if staring too long might make them guilty by association. I straightened my back, forcing my hands to stay steady at my sides. My heart was a drum against my ribs, but I refused to let it shake my voice, or worse, show in my tears. Beside me, Hadrian leaned back slightly, smirk curling across his lips as if he owned the air we breathed. It wasn't rage that fueled him. I could see it now. It was something colder. Calculated. Every move of his had been precise, designed to remind me and everyone else that in his mind, I didn't belong here. I caught the glance of two officers seated behind me. They leaned toward one another, their voices just above a whisper, but I caught enough. She doesn't belong here, just like he said. The words sliced deeper than any slap. My breath caught in my chest, but I didn't turn around. I didn't need to see their faces. I already knew what they looked like, smug, certain, nodding as if the lie had always been the truth. Hadrian's smirk deepened, as if he'd heard them too, as if their agreement was the crown he'd been waiting to wear. I swallowed hard, steadying myself. Silence was dangerous. It gave people permission to believe the worst, but speaking too soon, too raw, might give him the satisfaction of watching me unravel. Then, a voice cut through the room. Calm, clear, unmistakable. Mrs. Latham? I turned. The Admiral himself stood a few feet away, his uniform immaculate, his expression unreadable, yet piercing enough to silence the whispers around us. Or should I say, Dr. Latham? The hall stilled. My title. Not Hadrian's version of me. Not the sister who tagged along. Not the failure who married well. He had named me for what I had worked for, what I had earned. I nodded once, trying not to let the relief spill over into my face. Admiral, I managed, voice even. Hadrian's smirk faltered. Just a flicker, but I saw it. The Admiral hadn't raised his tone, hadn't scolded, hadn't even looked at Hadrian. He didn't need to. By recognizing me, out loud, in front of everyone, he had undercut my brother's narrative in one stroke. Around us, I caught the subtle shifts. A few heads tilted, reassessing. The wives who had been whispering moments before looked down at their laps. The sting in my chest remained, but a fragile thread of dignity began weaving itself back together. I let out a slow breath, holding myself steady. I wasn't foolish enough to think this was over. If anything, I knew my brother too well. Recognition from the Admiral wasn't the end. It was the spark that would push Hadrian to strike harder. Still, in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. The possibility that he didn't hold all the power. The way the Admiral looked at me that night, I realized, for the first time, Hadrian might not hold all the power. But Hadrian wasn't done yet. He'd push harder, and this time, I'd have to decide how far I was willing to let him go. 2 days later, the sting of his hand had faded from my cheek, but the whispers hadn't. They lingered like smoke in the air, curling around me no matter where I went. At the Pentagon-affiliated banquet hall, the chatter was as polished as the silverware, yet I could feel the eyes, the subtle nods, the glances traded behind raised glasses. The room was breathtaking, crystal chandeliers casting warm light across tables dressed in ivory linen, the hum of conversation blending with the faint notes of a string quartet tucked in the corner. But I might as well have been invisible. I sat near the edge of the room, not because I wanted to, but because the seating chart made sure of it. I was far enough from the head table that I couldn't hear the speeches clearly, yet close enough to feel the weight of being deliberately placed out of view. Hadrian thrived under the lights, moving from table to table with a smile that seemed rehearsed. I caught him leaning toward a cluster of officers' spouses, his voice lowered but carrying just enough for me to catch. "She's just here because of pity," he said smoothly. "Without me, she'd be nowhere." Their laughter, soft and complicit, crawled under my skin. I gripped my glass tighter, the stem pressing against my fingers as though it could keep me steady. For a moment, I told myself it wasn't worth reacting, that maybe letting it slide, again, was the only way to keep the peace. My entire life had been a practice in swallowing words, in nodding when I wanted to scream. If I kept quiet, the night would end, and I could walk out without more damage. But as I glanced at the table, I saw them smiling at him, their eyes flicking toward me with pity, thinly veiled as politeness. That look was worse than laughter. Pity is what you give to someone you've already written off. "Don't let him win," a quiet voice murmured. I turned to see Alden, a colleague I'd trusted over the years, sliding into the empty chair beside me. He didn't look directly at me, just fixed his gaze on the stage as though we were discussing the weather. "He's setting the stage," Alden added under his breath. "If you let him define the story, they'll believe him." I forced a small smile, though my chest felt heavy. What am I supposed to do? Stand up and shout across the hall? "No," Alden said calmly. "But you'll know when the time comes." The rest of the evening dragged, every moment stretching longer than the last. I kept my eyes on the program, pretending to read the list of honorees while fighting the urge to leave. By the time dessert was cleared, I'd almost convinced myself to fade away quietly, like I always had. That's when Alden leaned closer and slipped a sealed envelope onto the table, sliding it under my napkin with practiced discretion. "Take this when you get home," he whispered. "Don't open it here." My breath caught. "What is it?" "Proof," he said simply, his eyes finally meeting mine. "Don't wait too long." The envelope felt heavier than paper should. I kept it pressed against my side all through the closing remarks, the weight of it anchoring me even as my mind raced. Later, in the quiet of my car, I broke the seal. Inside were copies of official papers, documents that showed my name had once been listed for a major recognition tied to my work on a Pentagon project. The ink was clear, the signature authentic, but across the margin was a notation, cold and clinical. Name removed upon request, Hadrian Latham. My vision blurred. My own brother had erased me, again. Not just in whispers, not just in front of family, but in the records that proved my worth. As I stared at the papers in my trembling hands, one thought burned clear. This time, I wasn't going to stay silent. But breaking my silence would come at a cost, and Hadrian was ready to make me pay. By the end of that week, I found myself walking into yet another Pentagon-affiliated dinner. The hall was grand, all polished wood and gleaming brass, but the weight in my chest made every step feel heavier than the last. I carried the sealed envelope in my purse, the very one Alden had slipped to me days earlier. Its presence was like a steady drumbeat, reminding me that the decision I'd make tonight could change everything. The room was crowded, the kind of gathering where laughter was practiced and every smile seemed rehearsed. Senior officers stood near the stage, their wives in elegant gowns exchanging polite greetings, while the younger staff tried to look composed under the scrutiny of their superiors. I slipped into my seat near the middle of the hall, just far enough from Hadrian to avoid conversation, but close enough to hear him. Hadrian was thriving, as always. He leaned casually against a table, spinning some tale that had his audience leaning in with interest. I caught fragments of his words, each one sharper than the last. "She's lucky to even be allowed in this room," he said, his tone dripping with false pity. "Without me, she'd be waiting tables somewhere." The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was enough. Enough to twist the knife deeper. Enough to make my hand tighten around the purse resting in my lap. I thought of every year I'd worked quietly in the background, every late night I'd poured into projects without so much as a thank you, and how easily he'd erased me with a single sentence. I forced myself to sit straight, my fork steady as I moved food across my plate I couldn't bring myself to eat. My silence felt suffocating, almost complicit. If I said nothing, wasn't I proving him right? Alden sat just a seat away, his eyes flicking toward me when no one else was watching. He gave the smallest nod, a subtle encouragement that carried more weight than words. It steadied me, reminded me I wasn't imagining things. that I wasn't as invisible as Hadrian wanted me to believe. The dinner stretched on. Courses came and went, servers moving quietly through the hall. Conversation rose and fell around me, but the envelope in my purse seemed to grow heavier with every passing minute. My mind replayed Aunt Celeste's words from years ago. One day they'll choke on what they've done to you. I hadn't believed her then. Tonight, I almost did. When the Admiral finally rose to make his rounds, the room shifted. Conversations softened, and heads turned in his direction. He was a man whose presence commanded silence without ever raising his voice. And as he made his way past our table, shaking hands, exchanging polite words, I felt my pulse quicken. This was the moment. My hand moved almost on its own, slipping the envelope from my purse. As the Admiral approached, I placed it discreetly beneath the program on the table, pushing it toward him with a calm smile, as though I were handing him nothing more than a note of appreciation. Our fingers brushed briefly as he took it, and his eyes flicked to mine, steady, unreadable, but sharp enough to pierce through the tension. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he tucked it into the inside of his jacket with the same measured grace he used for everything. But when his gaze shifted to Hadrian across the table, I saw it, the faintest tightening of his jaw, the kind of controlled anger that said he had read enough in that instant to understand. Hadrian, oblivious, smirked as if the room belonged to him. He laughed a little too loudly at his own joke, his hand sweeping through the air as if he were giving a performance. The officers around him chuckled politely, but I noticed the Admiral's eyes lingering, colder now, weighing him silently. For the first time in a long time, I felt the smallest flicker of something other than shame. Not triumph yet, but the beginning of a shift. A quiet assurance that the tide was turning, even if no one else could see it yet. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I hardly heard the toasts or the announcements. My attention was locked on that unspoken exchange, the Admiral's glance a promise that the game had changed. When the dinner finally ended and guests began to filter out, Hadrian threw me a smug look, as though he'd secured the final word. I didn't return it. I didn't need to. Because across the table, the Admiral's eyes met mine once more. And in that look, steady and unflinching, I knew I wasn't alone anymore. But Hadrian wasn't finished. He had one last vicious move, and it would push everything to the breaking point. 2 days later, I walked into yet another Pentagon reception, the kind where every smile was calculated and every word weighed like it might echo in the halls of power. The chandeliers above sparkled like nothing had ever gone wrong in this place, but I knew better. The envelope I had passed to the Admiral still burned in my mind. It had shifted something, though quietly. I could feel it in the way eyes lingered a little longer when they landed on Hadrian. Still, I braced myself. Men like him didn't go down quietly. The air was thick with chatter, polished laughter floating over the sound of silverware and crystal glasses. I took a seat near the end of the table, deliberately choosing a spot where I wouldn't be in the center of attention, but close enough to watch Hadrian. Alden sat a few chairs down, his presence a silent reassurance. He didn't need to say anything. I could tell by the way he glanced at me, steady and calm, that he was ready if I needed him. Hadrian, meanwhile, was in full form. He thrived in these rooms, weaving himself into every conversation, flashing that smug smile as if he owned the ground we stood on. I knew the arrogance was covering fear now, but it didn't make his voice any easier to hear. Halfway through dinner, he rose casually from his chair and leaned against the table where a cluster of senior spouses sat listening. I watched as he pulled a folder from his briefcase with a practiced flourish. "You all want to know the truth about my dear sister?" His voice carried just enough to draw heads from other tables. He slid a paper across the linen tablecloth, his smile sharp. "Here it is. Proof she's been misusing Pentagon funds for her personal whims. She hides behind her husband's name and connections, but the truth always comes out." The blood drained from my face. Every whisper I'd endured until now felt like it had been preparing me for this moment. My fingers trembled as I gripped the edge of my chair, forcing myself not to look away. Around me, the murmurs started again, low, dangerous. I heard the words fraud and shame ripple through the air like poison. I wanted to shout, to rip the paper from the table and tear it to shreds, but my body wouldn't move. Fear pinned me in place, whispering that maybe this was the moment I would finally lose everything. And then the Admiral stood. The entire room hushed. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, the kind that commanded attention without a single word. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and drew out a second envelope, the very one I had given him days before. Without a word, he placed it on the table beside Hadrian's so-called evidence. I could see the shift in the crowd as he opened both, laying the pages flat for everyone nearby to see. His eyes flicked to Hadrian, cool and sharp. "Interesting," he said, his voice calm but cutting through the silence like a blade. "One of these is authentic. The other—" He let the words hang, his gaze steady on Hadrian. "Is a forgery." The room seemed to hold its breath. I couldn't move, couldn't blink, as the Admiral slowly rotated the papers so the others could see. "This," he tapped the document I had given him, "is verified. Official. This," his finger shifted to Hadrian's, "is false. And I don't need to tell anyone here what attempting to pass off a forged document implies." Hadrian's smirk faltered. Just barely, but enough for me to see it. For the first time since this nightmare began, fear flickered in his eyes. He tried to recover, clearing his throat with a laugh that didn't sound like him. "You've misunderstood. I was only—" "No," the Admiral interrupted, his voice still calm, but the steel beneath it undeniable. "We've understood perfectly." The crowd's murmurs shifted, no longer sharp and accusing, but curious, some even edged with satisfaction. The balance in the room had tilted, and everyone felt it. I sat frozen, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break through my chest. Relief and dread tangled together inside me. The Admiral had cut through Hadrian's lie, but I knew my brother well enough to understand this wasn't the end. Fear made desperate men reckless. The Admiral's hand rested lightly on the real document as his eyes met mine across the table. No words passed between us, but I understood. This wasn't over. Not yet. But fear makes desperate men reckless, and Hadrian still had one more card to play. The hall was so quiet you could hear the soft clicks of cameras from the press gallery in the back. The Admiral's revelations still lingered in the air, leaving Hadrian cornered, his charm stripped bare. I stood rooted in place, the blood still pounding in my ears, my hands clenched at my sides. Every glance in the room was a dagger, some sharp with judgment, others hesitant with sympathy. Hadrian's face glistened with sweat. I could see the panic simmering beneath his forced grin as he adjusted his jacket, trying to recover. He glanced toward me, his eyes full of venom, then back at the crowd. He was desperate, and desperate men don't retreat quietly. Then, with a sudden sharpness, his voice rang out. "You all think she belongs here?" he spat, loud enough that the entire hall froze. "She clawed her way in by selling herself. Don't look so shocked. You know it's true. That's the only way someone like her could stand in this room." Gasps rippled through the hall like a shockwave. The words slammed into me harder than any slap ever could. My chest tightened, and for a split second, I felt my knees weaken. He hadn't just attacked my place here, he had tried to annihilate my dignity, my very worth. I could feel the heat rising up my neck, the sting of humiliation all over again, but I refused to let tears fall. My silence stretched, the weight of the insult settling into the room. Around me, dignitaries shifted uncomfortably, some looking at me as if waiting to see whether I'd break, others avoiding my eyes entirely. Before I could draw a breath to respond, the Admiral's voice cut through the tension, calm, cold, and final. "Touch my wife again, Hadrian, and see." The words landed like a thunderclap. For a moment, It felt as though the entire hall forgot how to breathe. Heads snapped toward the Admiral, jaws slack, eyes wide. My heart lurched, not just from the claim, but from the weight of his protection spoken so plainly, so publicly. Hadrian's face drained of color. His smirk faltered into a twitch, and his mouth opened and closed like he was searching for words that would not come. The whispering in the hall turned into an audible hum, shock, disbelief, and something else, the undeniable recognition that his downfall was sealed. The Admiral stepped forward, slow and deliberate, his eyes locked on Hadrian. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. "You've crossed a line you can't return from." Two uniformed guards appeared quietly at the edges of the room. For a heartbeat, Hadrian seemed frozen, his chest heaving, his gaze darting wildly as though some miracle might rescue him. But there was none. As the guards approached, he tried to laugh, the sound hollow, desperate. "This is a mistake. You're all being fooled. Enough!" The Admiral's voice snapped like steel, silencing him instantly. The guards took his arms firmly, steering him toward the back doors. He resisted for a moment, jerking against their grip, but the fight drained from him as the reality sank in. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. As he passed, his eyes found mine. The venom was still there, burning, but powerless now. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one trembling. I held his gaze without flinching, the sting of his words still lingering but unable to crush me anymore. The room was silent, save for the echo of his footsteps being dragged away. My chest rose and fell slowly as I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Justice didn't always come wrapped in triumph, but in that moment, it was enough. But even as he disappeared through those doors, I knew the scars he left behind would not vanish so easily. Weeks passed, though in my heart the echo of that night at the Pentagon still lingered. Arlington was quiet this time of year. The evenings carried a crisp stillness, and from my apartment window, the city lights shimmered like distant stars. I sat curled on the couch with a cup of chamomile tea, both hands wrapped around it, as if the warmth could seep into the places inside me that still felt raw. The television in the corner was muted, playing the evening news. Every so often, a headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen about investigations into government fraud. Hadrian's name appeared again and again, though I didn't need the confirmation. The sealed envelope had already changed everything, and the Admiral's voice that night had silenced my brother in ways I could never have dreamed of. I wasn't celebrating. Not really. There was no joy in watching someone I once loved spiral into disgrace. Instead, there was a strange heaviness, a mourning for the years I had spent bending, breaking, and shrinking myself so he could loom larger. The kettle in the kitchen clicked softly as it cooled, and I let the silence settle. It was no longer a silence of shame or fear. It was one I chose. A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. When I opened it, Alden stood there, holding a brown paper bag with the faint smell of takeout drifting out. "I figured you might not have cooked," he said simply, stepping inside when I waved him in. I smiled faintly, setting the bag on the counter. "You always assume I forget to eat." He chuckled. "Not forget, just put it last on the list." He leaned against the counter, studying me. "How are you holding up?" I hesitated, staring down at my tea before answering. "Better than I thought I'd be." "Worse than I wanted." He nodded, not pushing, just letting the words breathe. That was Alden's way, never forcing me to share more than I could. After we ate, he slid an envelope across the table. My chest tightened. For a second, I thought it might be another blow waiting for me. "Don't worry," Alden said softly. "It's good news." With trembling fingers, I opened it. Inside was a short letter stamped with an official seal. Confirmation that Hadrian was under full investigation for fraud and would never hold public office again. My throat tightened, but not from triumph. I traced the edge of the paper slowly. It feels strange, I whispered. Like I should feel vindicated. But I don't. I just feel tired. Alden's eyes softened. You don't need to feel anything you're not ready to. You didn't fight for this so he'd fall. You fought so you'd finally be seen. The truth of that sank deep. I reached over to the small side table and picked up a torn corner of the program from that night, the one where my name had been left out, as though I didn't exist. I had kept it, not as a wound, but as a reminder, a symbol that even when I was erased, I was still there. I held it between my fingers, the edges frayed, and whispered, it was never about winning. It was about finally being seen. The Admiral wasn't there that evening. He was still tied up with official duties. But I didn't need him to stand beside me now. His words had already changed the course of everything, and his quiet presence in my life was more than enough. Alden gathered his coat to leave, pausing at the door. You did more than survive, Rowena. You reclaimed yourself. After he left, I sat by the window again, sipping the last of my tea as the city lights twinkled below. The ache of old wounds still pulsed, but they no longer dictated who I was. I set the torn program on the windowsill, the faint lamplight catching its edge, and let out a breath that felt like the first free one in years. I learned that sometimes silence isn't weakness. It's the loudest answer you'll ever give. Do you think I was too cold? Or finally free?